This is Raya Tapia from NDN, and I'm very happy to introduce our new chair for the Latin America Policy Initiative, Nelson Cunningham. Nelson has a long-time commitment and history working with the region of Latin America, and this includes having been advisor to the Western Hemisphere affairs for President Bill Clinton, having worked on the Kerry transition, Kerry advising team for issues related to Latin America, and also the Obama transition team. So Nelson, thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, and I'm very proud of NDN for starting this initiative and for trying to put as much focus on U.S. Latin American affairs as NDN is doing.
Thank you. And I guess the most recent topic to talk about as far as a multilateral event was the Summit of the Americas. Now, this summit was quite different from Mar del Plata, Argentina, where the summit was somewhat plagued with some setbacks. How would you say this recent summit and its participants have evolved since Mar del Plata, and what is your take in general of the outcome of the Summit of the Americas?
Well, it was a dramatically different meeting, and it was dramatically different for two reasons. One, the most important, the U.S. has new leadership. George Bush was such a polarizing figure in Latin America. He fits so many stereotypes that Latins have about the ugly American, the arrogant American, the imperialist American. It made it very easy for people like Hugo Chavez and others to rally popular support against him and to fan the flames of anti-American sentiment. It's much harder to do that with a new president who is not only the first president of color that the United States has elected, but also one who comes to Latin America with an open hand and with a clear desire to improve relations in the region, to take a respectful, listening, partnership approach with Latin America that couldn't be different from George Bush's approach. That's the most important difference between the summit in Mar del Plata several years ago and this one today. And the second factor is the U.S. is up, but clearly Venezuela and Hugo Chavez are down. The price of oil is off dramatically. Chavez has fewer resources that he can use to spread influence around Latin America. And also he is increasingly personally isolated from the other leaders who I think are becoming increasingly concerned about his authoritarian tendencies and his anti-democratic instincts. And this has reduced his influence in the region at the same time that the American president arrives. Very different meeting.
And on that note, there was a moment when President Chavez presented President Obama with a gift for a book, and of course they met and shook hands, and that has caused some controversy in the U.S. media. What's your take on the media's reaction here in the U.S. to that encounter?
Well, as usual, it's all a little bit short-handed and short-sighted. The media coverage focuses on one or two things. There were actually three different encounters between Obama and Chavez at the Summit of the Americas, and I think it's very telling how the three encounters came about. The first was Chavez bounding over to Obama and with a giant grin shaking his hand and saying, I want to be your friend, in English, not a language that Hugo Chavez frequently speaks. I think Chavez himself decided that may have been a little too friendly, so the next day he buttonholed Obama and gave him a book about 500 years of American imperialism, just to balance things. The third encounter is the one that has been least commented upon and noted, but it was carried extensively on Venezuelan television and has now been moved, I think the Huffington Post and other places now have links to it. But Obama and Chavez stand for about 5 minutes talking, and in this clip, Obama is talking very firmly to Chavez with his finger in his face, making some clear, definite points. And Chavez isn't blustering, he isn't, he is standing there listening, frankly, fairly respectfully to what President Obama is telling him. I think if you add up those three encounters with a public and I think needed expression of a desire for a new relationship. You have Chavez, who had to make a gesture with the 500 years of imperialism. But then you have Obama following up with Chavez and clearly laying some serious points on him. That strikes me as about the right place for the U.S. and Venezuela to be trying to restart the relationship, symbolized by the fact that, ultimately by the fact that Chavez indicated he would like to send an ambassador to the United States, having withdrawn his ambassador last September in the waning days of the Bush administration.
And many consider that that would be the first sort of initial step, right?
It's a first step.
Mm-hmm.
Chavez is going to sorely miss George Bush. It was very good for Chavez's popularity, both within Venezuela and around the region, for him to attack George Bush as publicly as he did. He has to figure out how to work with a president who doesn't, with an American president who doesn't engender the same sort of public hostility that our previous president did.
As a Venezuelan blog put it, Chavez succumbs to Obama's charisma over the summit.
He did, and he wasn't the only one.
Mm-hmm. And in general, with other Latin American countries as well, are we seeing a real shift in U.S. policy towards Latin America, or have we just begun to change the tone right now, particularly in view of the current Colombia and Panama FTAs that we have in Congress? And do you expect to see those FTAs taken up by Congress this year?
Frankly, the change in tone is as important as anything else. When you actually dissect the Bush policies toward Latin America, there were some very good policies there. Not only was there, I think, a measured attempt to continue to bind Latin America to us through trade agreements, but there was also an emphasis, particularly in the second term, and Secretary Rice is responsible for a good deal of this, for programs that focused on social justice and economic development. But nobody paid any attention to those, because the overall storyline between the U.S. and Latin America was that the U.S. was imperialistic, aggressive, and unilateralist, and wasn't interested in a relationship of mutual respect with Latin America. I see no real need to throw out many of the Bush policies. There are some that clearly need changing, but not wholesale. What did need changing was the Bush tone, and that's clearly what we're seeing Obama doing. Working with the Latins, with the Latin Americans, if Obama can establish that tone of mutual respect, and he made a great start in Trinidad, I think we will have gone a long way toward pushing that reset button for Latin America.
Several presidents from Latin America commented on Obama's statement, highlighting that there's no superior or inferior partner, but everyone's an equal partner, and we're very encouraged by this. So do you also believe that these leaders in Latin America will similarly continue this goodwill towards advancing relations?
Absolutely. I think many of them were growing, frankly, frustrated of a perceived U.S.-Latin American divide. It put many of them in a difficult position because they didn't want to have to choose sides between their neighbors in Latin America and the United States. They wanted to have good relations with both. They were also tired of what I consider to be, and what many of them consider to be, old-fashioned arguments of left versus right. I think we can approach Latin America now without ideology, and instead judge leaders and judge governments down there by the extent to which they focus on their people's interests and focus on strengthening democracy and economic institutions.
And similarly, we also understand that our relationship with these countries goes far beyond just an economic one or just one based on trade agreements. But we do know that Colombia and Panama are both very concerned about having the FTA with the U.S. approved in the U.S. What is your take on that? What is the importance of this FTA, and do you think this could be passed for either country this year?
Let me start with 2 points. The first is, I think trade agreements, if they're properly crafted, can be remarkably effective ways to link the interests of the United States to those of other countries. I think if you look at NAFTA, which is broadly misunderstood in the United States, but NAFTA has done more to link the United States to Canada, and to Mexico than anything else. Once a trade agreement is signed and ratified by the Congresses or parliaments of the respective countries, that is an alliance that is very, very difficult to shake or to break. And that strengthening is terribly important. I think it's critical for the Obama administration to find a path back toward appropriately liberalized trade with our neighbors as a way to link our future to theirs. Now, the problem with the Bush administration policy is that trade too often seemed like a one-note policy. It was the only policy that President Bush ever himself highlighted with regard to Latin America. It appeared to be the only way with which he measured our relationship with Latin America. That was a mistake. Our relationship with the countries of the hemisphere is much broader. Of course, economics is part of it. Of course, trade is a small part of overall economics. But a much broader part are working together on projects of social justice and economic development, which particularly in the hard economic times we all find ourselves now are critical.
And turning now a bit closer to home, to Mexico. Mexico is considered one of our most important allies in the hemisphere. How do you think that this current drug crisis combined with the health crisis is going to affect our relationship with Mexico?
I'd say the Mexican relationship under Bush was one of the biggest disappointments because Bush started with a real focus on Mexico. We all remember that he invited Vicente Fox to the White House for a state visit that happened by bad circumstances to be just days before the attacks of September 11th. I fault the Bush administration for not having been able to both reorient our foreign policy to fight a war on terror, but at the same time continue the very positive initiative with Mexico that President Bush had promised and that he had undertaken. U.S.-Mexico relations have sadly been lacking in recent years. I think that President Obama started his administration with a clear focus on rebuilding that relationship with Mexico. The first leader that he met after the election was in fact Felipe Calderon. He met with him here in Washington just days before his inaugural. One of Hillary Clinton's early trips abroad as Secretary of State was to Mexico, and there she made some path-breaking statements acknowledging U.S. responsibility and complicity in the war on drugs, the need to control our demand for drugs at the same time that we insist that the Mexicans control the supply of drugs. You saw Secretary Clinton acknowledge that many of the guns that go into Mexico and are fueling this drug violence come from the United States, and that the United States must do something about that flow of traffic. The next week, you saw Eric Holder, our Attorney General, you saw Janet Napolitano, our Secretary of Homeland Security, both traveled to Mexico to emphasize these points, to continue building relationships with their Mexican counterparts. And then, of course, 2 weeks after that, President Obama had a very successful trip to Mexico in which he pledged cooperation across a whole broad scale of issues. And at the same time, reassured the Mexicans that he would not put renegotiating NAFTA at the top of his list of priorities. So across the board, Obama has worked very hard to make clear that he would view the issues that Mexico faces on its side of the border and that both countries face in dealing with a border that is one of the longest in the world, that would be done in a spirit of mutual partnership. Now, the swine flu epidemic and the pandemic that is now hitting Mexico City and other parts of Mexico is likely in the days to come to put this relationship under tremendous strain. The Mexican public health system has got to go into high gear to try to contain this. The Mexicans seem to be approaching this with the level of seriousness that we would want them to. They're going to need the help of the world, I think, to bring the public health tools to bear on this, and then the cooperation of the world to appropriately contain this pandemic and not to cause it to expand too dramatically further. If the pandemic moves north within Mexico, and moves up closer to the border with Texas, California, Arizona, I think then you will see a real reaction on the U.S. side, and that's when you'll begin seeing border restrictions on both flow of people and flow of goods that could have a dramatic and negative impact on our relations with Mexico.
And how do you see Mexico handling these two crises? Do you feel that, how is Mexico coping with these two crises at the same time?
It's too soon to know what the ultimate impact is going to be on Mexico. The economic impact on Mexico City is clearly right now beginning to be dramatic. Schools are closed, people aren't going shopping, people aren't going to the movies, they're staying at home. It's probably good for DVD sales and good for cable television rentals, but it's not good for anything else. This is an essential public health step that has to be taken. I think Mexico, very much to its credit, is being thoughtful and responsible in the way that it is trying to limit the contacts that its people have with each other. But there will be a long-term economic impact on this if this continues much beyond next week or the week after, and especially if it spreads throughout Mexico.
Now, turning to another major partner, Brazil, of the U.S. What is your take on the importance of Brazil? What steps can the U.S. take to continue fostering that relationship, and likewise Brazil? What is your take on the importance of that relationship?
Well, Brazil over the last several years has become, in many respects, the newly confident leader of South America. Under President Lula has forged an economic and a political consensus there, coming from the left, but in some regards governing from the right. He has helped knit together both ends of that ideological spectrum in Brazil and forge a consensus for how Brazil can move forward. He's also moved to make Brazil not just a national power, but also a regional power and even a global power. I think that should all be welcomed by the United States, and in fact, President Bush welcomed it. President Bush worked very hard to forge a positive relationship with President Lula, and President Lula worked very hard to forge a positive relationship with President Bush, and that was good. It was limited, but it was good as far as it went. I think the potential for the relationship between the United States and Brazil under President Obama is dramatically ahead of where even it was able to go under President Bush. President Obama has extended clearly an open hand to President Lula. Their meeting in Washington in March was extremely positive. President Obama made a point of searching out President Lula at the G20 meeting in London and saying loudly, "I love this guy. He's the most popular president in the world," and making a very public embrace of Lula. And he accepted President Lula's invitation to schedule a trip to Brazil in months to come, and we look forward to that trip happening. Right now, I think all the basis is laid for Brazil and the United States to take this new relationship to even more substantially greater heights than it has achieved now. I think, we can all imagine what the visit of America's first African-American president would be to a country that has the largest African population in Latin America. The rapturous reception that they will give Barack Obama when he arrives in Rio or Sao Paulo will be stupendous, and I think will really help to knit together U.S.-Brazilian relations for many years to come.
And likewise, Panama. We have a new president. Panama will soon have a new administration come this summer. What is your take on the future of U.S.-Panamanian relationship as well?
Well, Panama, of course, is a country I know well. I lived there as a boy. I have a great deal of affection for Panama. The roots between Panama and the United States go back to literally Panama's founding, and the very close relationship that Panama and the United States have had has been a real foundation for U.S. relations with Central America and with the Caribbean for many, many years. The strategic relationship with the canal continues even after the turnover of the canal zone and the canal to Panama over 20 years ago. At this moment, the U.S.-Panama Free Trade Agreement is pending before our Congress. I credit President Obama for having sent clear signals that he wants to move this trade agreement and move it clearly and move it quickly. There are some last-minute issues that we understand are being worked right now between the U.S. and Panama, but I think it's fairly clear that there's a desire on the part of both the Americans and the Panamanians to get this trade agreement ratified by the United States before the Torrijos administration comes to an end later this year. And frankly, as an acknowledgement of the fact that it was Torrijos and his team, including Vice President Samuel Lewis, who negotiated the agreement and who deserve the credit for having it ratified by the United States if they can conclude these final open points.
And now also, in regards to Cuba, we've seen a shifting of policy with a recent easing of travel restrictions for Cuban Americans to the island. Do you think this means that we'll see a lifting of all restrictions? And if so, in how much time would you expect that? Or do you think this is just a preliminary step and we still need to see Cuba's response?
I think it's plain that we are at an inflection point in our history with Cuba. And this is an inflection point that is caused by two things. One, the increasing fading of Fidel Castro as a force. His illness has moved him to the sidelines. Raul Castro has come in small ways, cell phones, property ownership. He has begun to relax some of the restrictions of the Fidel Castro era and to show an openness to new ways of thinking. And that passing of that older generation of leaders, symbolized by Fidel Castro, is tremendously important in helping change the psychology of the relationship between the two countries. And the other factor is the arrival of a new president here in the United States, Barack Obama, who was willing to set aside some of the old, tired debates on Cuba and to do as he's doing elsewhere around the world, which is to an extended open hand. Now, he's not being naive in this. He is not, in my judgment, going too far in this. He took a small, measured step, and then he waited to see what Raul Castro would do in response. Raul Castro responded almost immediately by saying Cuba would be willing to sit down with the United States and to discuss everything. Political prisoners, elections, freedoms, everything. A dramatic statement on the part of Raul Castro. Now comes the hard part. How do you actually get government representatives from the U.S. and Cuba to sit down? Under what format? What are the ground rules? What can they discuss? Anybody who's followed Cuba over the last 40 years knows that every step forward is met by sometimes 2 steps backward, sometimes 5 steps backward. So we'll have to see whether or not we can really achieve a meaningful change in relationship with Cuba. But because of generational shifts here and in Cuba, I think the possibility is clearly there that we can set aside some of the old animosities and allow a new relationship that will frankly help us carry out the goal that I think we should all have here in the United States, which is to bring a new birth of freedom in Cuba, not by pushing them aside, but by embracing them and allowing the world to come to Cuba in a way that will help hasten the end of the Castro regime and of the authoritarian policies that have reigned there for far too long.
To what extent do you feel Fidel Castro could be an obstacle to this moving forward, given that soon after Raul made these comments that are encouraging, Fidel came out and spoke against them, essentially?
Well, Cuba watchers are looking at this closely, and some have theorized that there's a great split between Raul and Fidel, and that this is being fought behind the scenes within the Cuban power structure. You saw 2 of Fidel's long-standing lieutenants were moved aside a month or so ago by Raul, and some saw this as a sign of dramatic fighting between the two. It's hard to know. We have few ways of really assessing accurately what's going on within Cuba and the Cuban regime. But I do think that what is evident is that as this older generation moves along, you are going to see battles. There are going to be hardliners, both within the older generation and within the younger generation. You're going to have reformers both in the older generation and the newer generation. And as the older generation moves aside, you're going to have that battle between hardliners and reformers will continue. We don't know yet who the new generation of leaders will be in Cuba. We don't know that for certain. But I think it's almost certain that this debate between reform and hardline is going to be one that is going to become increasingly evident within Cuban political society.
And to wrap up, just with a more general overview of the region, oftentimes here in the U.S., Venezuela, and the anti-American attacks kind of take the attention from actual salient issues in countries in Latin America. What other issues do you feel should be highlighted more here from various countries in the region?
Well, I think the economic crisis it has to be one of the key issues that the countries are focusing on and that the U.S. needs to be focusing on with regard to Latin America. This economic crisis has depressed commodities prices on which so much of Latin America depends. It has cut back on remittances from the United States and from Europe on which many Latin American countries depend. The Washington Consensus did not bring the economic benefits to many of the lower classes in Latin America that many had hoped. You can argue why it didn't. Some would argue that it was because the Washington Consensus wasn't really tried, except in one or two countries such as Chile, where in fact it did work. But the public perception is clearly that the Washington Consensus was wrong for Latin America, and they need to find a new path. In a time of economic troubles, at a time of increasing social unrest, as you see the lower classes suffering because of the economic crisis, I think it's going to be essential for the United States and our good allies in Latin America to find ways to ensure that as Latins put in new policies to deal with this economic crisis, that these are policies that remain outward-looking, that policies that remain open to trade and to increasing ties with neighbors and with the United States, that no countries in the region fall into xenophobia or protectionism, because that would be a dramatic step backward for a region that is seeing, for all the ups and downs, over the last 50 years, Latin America has become a dramatically different and a dramatically better place for almost all of its citizens. We need to continue on that path. I am immensely proud that we now have a president in the United States that understands that he can play a role of moral leadership with Latin America. And I am very excited by the prospect of the years ahead between the United States and Latin America at the beginning of this new relationship.
Thank you, Nelson. Thanks for your input and insight as always. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.